Not every call leads to an answer, some lead to something far worse. Shadows in the woods, whispers in the dark, and encounters that defy explanation. When fear comes knocking, who will answer? I've noticed the channel losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways to support me. It's quick, free, and ensures you keep getting awesome content. Your support means everything. Thank you so much. I've always liked the solitude of working in law enforcement in rural Maine. There's a quiet beauty to it, rolling forests, sprawling lakes, and roads that twist through endless miles of wilderness. Most nights, my shift consists of routine patrols and the occasional call about a neighbor dispute or a missing dog. But every so often, something happens that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your little corner of the world. It started on a cold November night. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, and the radio in my cruiser crackled with static as I patrolled the edge of town. The storm made the roads nearly impassable, the dirt trails through the woods turning into rivers of mud. I figured it would be a quiet night, maybe a few calls about fallen branches or flooding. Around midnight, the dispatcher's voice broke through the static. Unit 3, we've got a call from a hiker. Claims they saw lights near the old Davidson property, up in the northern woods. Can you check it out? I frowned, sitting up straighter in my seat. The Davidson property was a long-abandoned cabin tucked away in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. No one had lived there in decades. The place was notorious among locals for being haunted, though I'd always dismissed the stories as small-town gossip. Copy that, I said, turning the cruiser onto a gravel road that led toward the property. What kind of lights are we talking about? The dispatcher hesitated. The caller wasn't clear. Just said they saw strange lights moving through the trees. They were pretty shaken up. Got it. I'll check it out. The drive was slow and treacherous. The rain came down in heavy sheets, and my wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. The gravel road quickly gave way to a muddy trail, and I had to park the cruiser and continue on foot. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, pulling my hood tight against the rain as I started toward the cabin. The woods were eerily quiet, the sound of the rain muffled by the dense canopy of trees. My boots squelched in the mud as I followed the overgrown trail, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I kept my hand close to my sidearm, the weight of it a small comfort in the oppressive silence. After about 20 minutes, I saw it, the faint outline of the cabin, its sagging roof barely visible through the rain. The place looked even worse than I remembered, the wooden walls warped and covered in moss. One of the windows was broken, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. Sheriff's Department. I called out, stepping onto the creaking porch. Anyone here? The only response was the sound of the rain. I pushed the door open with my flashlight, shining the beam inside. The cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of wet wood and decay. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, and the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper. It looked like no one had set foot in the place for years. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, muddy tracks leading from the door toward the back of the cabin. My pulse quickened as I followed them, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The footprints led to a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden beneath an old rug. The door was slightly open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't ignore the footprints. Taking a deep breath, I gripped the edge of the trapdoor and lifted it fully open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the cabin. Sheriff's Department. I called again, my voice firm. If anyone's down there, make yourself known. No response. I shone my flashlight down the staircase. The steps were steep and covered in dust, the air below thick and stale. I descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a small basement, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars and old tools. At first, it seemed empty. Then my flashlight caught something on the far wall, a door. It was made of heavy, weathered wood, with iron hinges and no visible handle. Strange symbols were etched into the surface, symbols I didn't recognize. I moved closer, my heart pounding. The door gave off an unnatural chill, the air around it colder than the rest of the basement. I reached out to touch it, but before my hand made contact, I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the other side. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me. I stepped back, my flashlight shaking as I swept it around the room. There was no one there, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping and echoing in a language I couldn't understand. I backed toward the stairs, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Just as I reached the first step, the door creaked open, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to see what was on the other side. I bolted up the stairs, my boots thudding against the wood as I threw myself out of the cabin and into the rain. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on all sides. I could feel something behind me, something watching, but I didn't dare look back. When I reached the trail, I radioed dispatch, my voice shaking. "This is Unit 3. No sign of anyone at the Davidson property. Heading back to base." The drive back to town was a blur. The rain seemed to intensify, pounding against the windshield like a warning. When I finally reached the station, I sat in the cruiser for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I never told anyone about the basement or the door. Officially, the call was logged as unfounded, and the Davidson property was left to rot. But I can't stop thinking about that door, the symbols, the whispers, the cold. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that low, guttural sound in my dreams. I don't go near the Davidson property anymore. I don't even drive that stretch of road if I can help it. But no matter how far I stay from it, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that door, it's not staying there. I was working the late shift on one of those nights where it felt like the rain would never stop. The kind of storm where the drops are so heavy they almost hurt when they hit your skin, and the roads flood before you even have time to react. As a deputy sheriff in a small Midwest county, you learn to deal with bad weather. Most calls on nights like that were people sliding into ditches or reporting branches down across the road. That night, though, was different. It was about 10:30 p.m. when the call came in. A fisherman at the county reservoir claimed he saw someone walking along the water's edge. The caller said the figure wasn't responding when he tried to talk to them. Normally, this wouldn't raise too many alarms. Sometimes people wandered out to the reservoir late at night to think, to drink, or to get some peace and quiet. But the tone of the caller's voice caught my attention. He wasn't just worried, he sounded scared. "What do you mean they weren't responding?" I asked over the radio as I headed toward the reservoir. "He didn't say much else," the dispatcher replied. "Just that they looked wrong." "Wrong how?" "Didn't specify. Just asked for someone to check it out." I sighed, gripping the wheel tightly as I navigated the slick roads. The reservoir was about 15 minutes outside of town, surrounded by dense woods and a few winding trails. It was usually quiet at night, except for the occasional group of teens trying to start a campfire or someone sneaking out to fish where they weren't supposed to. By the time I reached the gravel lot near the reservoir, the rain was coming down in torrents, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I parked the cruiser and grabbed my flashlight, pulling my hood up against the downpour. The reservoir stretched out like a black mirror under the stormy sky, the water churning slightly from the wind. "Sheriff's Department," I called out, shining the flashlight toward the shoreline. "Anyone out here?" The only response was the sound of rain hitting the water. I moved closer to the water's edge, scanning the area with my light. The caller hadn't given an exact location, so I had to check the trails one by one. The reservoir was a popular spot during the day, but at night, it felt almost menacing. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like gnarled hands, and the sound of the rain seemed to amplify every creak and rustle. I was about to turn back when I saw it, a figure standing near the edge of the water, about 50 yards down the shore. They were facing the reservoir, their back to me, motionless except for the rain bouncing off their shoulders. From a distance, they looked like a man, tall and thin, with a dark coat that hung heavily in the rain. "Sir," I called out, moving closer. "This is the Sheriff's Department. Are you okay?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. I quickened my pace, my boots sinking slightly in the muddy ground as I closed the distance. "Sir, you can't be out here in this weather," I said, my voice firm. "It's not safe." I was about 20 feet away now, close enough to see that something was off. His posture was too stiff, his arms hanging unnaturally at his sides. His head was tilted slightly, as though he were staring at something in the water. I shone the flashlight directly at him, and that's when I realized he wasn't wet. Despite the rain pouring down, his coat and hair were bone dry. My stomach twisted, and I stopped in my tracks, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. "Sir," I said again, my voice shaking slightly. Slowly, the figure turned to face me. His face was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light, with eyes so dark they looked like empty sockets. His lips moved, but no sound came out, and for a moment, we just stood there, the rain pounding around us. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was too wide, too sharp, like his mouth wasn't designed for that kind of expression. He raised one hand and pointed toward the water, his movement slow and deliberate. "What's in the water?" I asked, taking a step back. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his feet not sinking into the mud like mine had. He moved with an unsettling grace, almost as though he were gliding. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, but I didn't draw it. I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. "Stay where you are," I said, my voice firmer now. "I'm not going to tell you again." He stopped, his hand still outstretched, pointing toward the reservoir. I followed his gesture, my flashlight sweeping over the churning water. For a moment, I didn't see anything. Then, a ripple broke the surface, followed by another, and another. Something was moving in the water. At first, I thought it was a large fish or maybe a log dislodged by the storm, but then I saw it, something pale and human-shaped, just below the surface. It drifted slowly, its limbs limp, its face turned away from me. My heart raced as I stepped closer to the edge, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Is someone in there?" I shouted, glancing back at the figure. He didn't respond. He just stood there, smiling that awful smile, his finger still pointing at the water. I moved closer, the mud sucking at my boots as I approached the shoreline. The pale figure in the water wasn't moving, and for a moment, I thought it might be a body. But as I leaned in for a closer look, it shifted. Its head turned slowly, and I saw its face, blank, featureless, with empty sockets where its eyes should have been. I stumbled back, my foot slipping in the mud, and fell hard onto the ground. When I looked up, the figure by the water's edge was gone. The pale thing in the water was gone too, the ripples fading into the rain. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I swept the flashlight around, but the shore was empty. The only sound was the rain, relentless and deafening. I ran back to the cruiser, my boots slipping and sliding in the mud. When I reached the car, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, but the shoreline was empty. No man, no pale figure, nothing but rain and shadows. I drove back to the station in silence, my mind racing. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, who would believe me. The report went down as, "No suspicious activity found," and I left it at that. But I've avoided the reservoir ever since. Sometimes, when it rains, I think about that night. I think about the man and his too wide smile, and the pale thing in the water. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed any longer. I've always preferred the night shift. There's a kind of calm in the darkness, a stillness that makes the hours go by quietly. But working as a sheriff's deputy in a small, rural county means the quiet can shift into something darker without warning. Sometimes, the things you see at night stick with you. This was one of those nights. It had been raining for hours, the kind of relentless downpour that made the roads slippery and visibility almost non-existent. I was patrolling the outskirts of town, a stretch of railroad tracks that cut through a dense patch of woods. The tracks hadn't been in use for years, and the area was known for being a hangout spot for teens looking to get into trouble. Mostly, my job was to break up small parties or chase off the occasional trespasser. That night, I wasn't expecting much. The rain had likely kept everyone indoors, and the tracks were silent except for the sound of water dripping off the trees. I had just finished looping around the far end of the county when the call came through. "Got a report of a woman walking along the tracks near mile marker 27, the dispatcher said. Caller sounded concerned. I frowned, checking my location. Mile marker 27 was about 2 miles from where I was, deep in the woods. What was the concern? I asked, already turning my cruiser toward the tracks. they said she looked off. Didn't give much detail. Just asked us to send someone. Copy that. I'm on my way. The road to the tracks was little more than a muddy path, barely wide enough for the cruiser. My headlights illuminated the dense trees on either side, their branches heavy with rain. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the sound of the storm filled the cabin like white noise. When I reached the tracks, I parked on the shoulder and stepped out into the rain. The air was cold, the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking along the tracks, the beam cutting through the darkness. Sheriff's Department. I called out, my voice barely carrying over the rain. Anyone out here? No response. The track stretched ahead of me, glistening in the faint light. The woods were eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife drowned out by the storm. I kept walking, my boots crunching on the gravel, the flashlight sweeping from side to side. After about 10 minutes, I saw her. A woman standing on the tracks, her back to me. She was wearing a long coat, soaked through from the rain, and her dark hair clung to her face and neck. She didn't move, didn't turn, just stood there like she was frozen. Ma'am. I called out, stopping a few feet away. Are you all right? She didn't respond. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms hanging limply at her sides. I took a cautious step closer, my grip tightening on the flashlight. Something about her felt wrong. Her posture, the stillness, it didn't feel natural. Ma'am, this is the Sheriff's Department, I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. I need you to step off the tracks and talk to me. Slowly, she turned. The movement was jerky, like it took more effort than it should have. When I saw her face, my stomach dropped. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were sunken and dark. She stared at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Do you need help? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed down the tracks, her arm trembling as though it was hard for her to hold it up. My flashlight followed her gesture, but the beam only illuminated more rain-soaked tracks and dense trees. There's nothing there, I said, turning back to her. But she was gone. My heart raced as I swept the flashlight around, searching for any sign of her. The tracks were empty, the woods silent except for the rain. I took a step forward, then froze when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. Help me. The voice came from the direction she had pointed. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't ignore it. I started down the tracks, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it sounded wrong. Like someone trying to imitate a human voice but not quite getting it right. The tracks curved ahead, disappearing into a dense tunnel of trees. I rounded the bend, my boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped dead in my tracks. A figure was lying across the rails, face down and motionless. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, the flashlight shaking as I pointed it at the figure. It was a man, his clothes torn and muddy, his body unnaturally twisted. For a moment, I thought he was dead, but then he moved, a slow, shuddering twitch that sent a chill down my spine. Sir. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Can you hear me? His head turned slightly, just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, and his lips moved as though he were trying to speak. I leaned closer, straining to hear him over the rain. They're watching, he whispered, his voice hoarse and ragged. Don't let them take me. Before I could respond, a shadow passed over the tracks, and the air grew colder. I turned, the flashlight cutting through the rain, and saw them, figures standing just beyond the tree line. They were tall and thin, their limbs too long, their faces obscured by the shadows. There were at least 5 of them, and they didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. I grabbed the man under his arms and tried to pull him off the tracks, but he was heavier than he looked, and my boots kept slipping in the mud. We need to go. I shouted, my voice breaking. Get up. He shook his head weakly, his eyes locking onto mine. You can't save me, he said. Run. The shadows moved closer, their movements smooth and unnatural, like they were gliding over the ground. I froze, torn between staying with the men and running for my life. But when one of the figures stepped onto the tracks, its face briefly illuminated by the flashlight, my decision was made. It wasn't a face. It was a void, a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. I let go of the men and bolted, my heart pounding as I ran back toward the cruiser. The rain blurred my vision, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't stop. I could hear the whispers behind me, growing louder, more insistent, but I didn't dare look back. When I reached the car, I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. The headlights cut through the rain, but the tracks were empty. No figures, no men, just the endless stretch of rails disappearing into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, the rain finally letting up as I pulled into the station. I never told anyone what I saw that night. When dispatch followed up on the call, they found nothing, no woman, no man, no sign that anyone had been there. But sometimes, when I drive past the tracks on a rainy night, I see her. Standing at the edge of the woods, her pale face watching as I pass by. I've been a patrol officer in rural Virginia for the better part of 15 years. Night shifts out here are usually quiet, deer darting across the road, the occasional stranded driver, or the rare call about suspicious activity in someone's backyard. But every now and then, you get a call that sticks with you, the kind you can't explain, the kind that makes you second-guess everything you thought you knew about the world. It was a rainy September evening, and I'd just started my shift. The storm had been rolling in all afternoon, heavy clouds swallowing the last bits of sunlight as the rain hammered against the windshield of my cruiser. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, pulling me out of my thoughts. "We've got a 911 call from an abandoned diner off Route 19, she said. Caller didn't give a name, just kept saying someone was outside. Someone outside? I repeated, frowning. Did they say anything else? Not much. They sounded shaken. We lost the connection before we could get more details. I hesitated. Everyone in town knew about the old diner. It had been shut down for decades, left to rot on a lonely stretch of highway that no one had any reason to drive anymore. People talked about it sometimes, spinning stories about ghosts and strange lights, but I'd never paid much attention. Still, a call was a call. "I'm on it," I said, turning the cruiser toward Route 19. The rain came down in sheets as I drove, the wipers struggling to keep up. The road was slick, and the dim glow of my headlights barely penetrated the darkness. The diner was about 20 minutes from town, and the closer I got, the more the unease set in. There was something about that stretch of road, the way the trees leaned in, their branches clawing at the sky, the way the rain seemed to muffle every sound except the hum of the engine. When I finally saw the diner, it looked just as I remembered it, a crumbling husk of a building with shattered windows and a rusted sign that read Harrison's. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and the whole place seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching over broken asphalt, and parked near the entrance. The rain drummed against the roof of the cruiser as I scanned the area with my spotlight. Nothing. No cars, no people, just the diner sitting in eerie silence. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the storm, the cold rain soaking through my uniform almost immediately. The air smelled of wet earth and rust, and the wind carried a faint, metallic tang that made my stomach turn. "Sheriff's Department." I called out, shining the flashlight toward the building. "Anyone here?" No response. I moved closer, my boots squelching in the mud. The diner's front door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind, and I could see the faint glow of a flickering light inside. "Hello." I called again, stepping onto the cracked concrete porch. "If you need help, say something." Still nothing. I pushed the door open with my flashlight, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the diner was just as dilapidated as the outside, broken tables and chairs scattered across the floor, peeling wallpaper, and a counter covered in dust and grime. The flickering light came from an old neon sign above the counter, somehow still functioning despite the state of the building. I walked further inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The rain pounded against the roof, and the wind howled through the broken windows, creating an eerie symphony that set my nerves on edge. "Who made the call?" I muttered to myself, scanning the room. That's when I saw it, a figure sitting in one of the booths near the back, their head bowed, hands resting on the table. My heart jumped, and I raised my flashlight. "Sir?" "Ma'am. Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, my boots crunching over broken glass. As I approached, the smell hit me, a sour, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. I stopped, my hand instinctively going to the grip of my sidearm. "Hey!" I called again, louder this time. "I need you to." The figure moved. Slowly, jerkily, they lifted their head and turned to face me. It was a man, his skin pale and waxy, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to back away. But before I could move, the man's head snapped to the side, as though he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, without warning, he stood up and walked toward the kitchen. "Wait!" I shouted, following him. "Stop right there." The man didn't stop. He disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors, and by the time I reached them, the room was empty. The kitchen was a wreck, rusted appliances, puddles of water from the leaking roof, and more of that sour, metallic smell. But the man was gone. I turned back to the dining area, my pulse racing. The booth where he'd been sitting was empty now, but something else caught my eye, a small, wet handprint on the table. Too small to belong to the man. My flashlight trembled as I scanned the room again, half expecting to see another figure lurking in the shadows. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle coming from the direction of the restrooms. It was a child's laugh, light and airy, but it sent a cold wave of fear through me. I moved toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped. I reached the restroom doors and pushed one open with my foot, my flashlight sweeping the small, grimy space. It was empty. I checked the other restroom, nothing. I backed away slowly, every nerve in my body on high alert. That's when I noticed something in the corner of the dining room, a door I hadn't seen before, partially hidden behind a stack of broken chairs. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dark staircase leading downward. A basement. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I didn't want to go down there, but I couldn't leave without checking. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs, my flashlight illuminating the narrow, damp steps. The basement was cold and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The walls were lined with old shelves filled with dusty jars and cans, and the floor was littered with debris. I moved cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then I saw it, a small, wooden door at the far end of the basement. It was newer than the rest of the room, its paint unchanged and its surface unblemished. My heart pounded as I approached it, the beam of my flashlight trembling against the wood. The door was locked. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the giggle, faint and echoing, as if it were coming from the other side of the door. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. I didn't know what was behind that door, and I didn't want to find out. I ran back up the stairs, my boots thudding against the steps. When I reached the main floor, the diner was darker than before, the flickering neon sign now dead. The rain outside seemed louder, pounding against the windows like a warning. I didn't look back. I made it to my cruiser and sped away, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't radio in. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. But to this day, I can still hear that laughter, faint and distant, every time it rains. I've been a deputy sheriff in a rural part of Oklahoma for the past 8 years. You see some strange things working night shifts in the middle of nowhere, strange but explainable, mostly. However, there's one call that still keeps me awake some nights, the kind of experience you don't bring up at the precinct because you know no one would believe you. It was late fall, maybe mid-November. A cold rain had been falling for hours, turning the dirt roads into slick, muddy trails. I was patrolling one of the more remote stretches of county highway, the kind of road no one uses unless they're hopelessly lost or up to no good. My headlights barely cut through the rain, and my wipers were working overtime to keep the windshield clear. I was about to call it a night when dispatch came through with a report of a stranded motorist. Normally, a call like that wouldn't be a big deal, but something about the details caught my attention. The caller was frantic, claiming she'd taken a wrong turn and her car was stuck. But the coordinates dispatch gave me didn't make any sense. They placed her on a road that didn't exist, at least not officially. "Are you sure about those coordinates?" I asked over the radio. That's what she gave us, the dispatcher replied. Said she was by a sign for Hollow Creek. I frowned. Hollow Creek wasn't a real place, not anymore. It had been an old mining town back in the early 1900s, but it had been abandoned for decades. Most of the roads leading to it were overgrown or washed out, and no one in their right mind would be driving out there, especially in this weather. Still, I didn't have much choice. A stranded motorist was a stranded motorist, and it was my job to help. I confirmed the call and started toward the area, my GPS struggling to keep up as I turned onto smaller and smaller roads. The rain made everything harder, visibility was terrible, and my tires kept slipping in the mud. After about 20 minutes, I saw it, a weathered wooden sign half hidden by overgrown brush. Hollow Creek, 3 miles. I radioed dispatch to let them know I was getting close, but my signal was starting to break up. The further I drove, the worse it got, until eventually, I lost contact completely. The road narrowed, the trees pressing in on either side like a tunnel. My gut told me to turn back, but I pushed on, telling myself the caller was probably just lost and panicking. After what felt like forever, my headlights caught the outline of a car up ahead. It was a small sedan, tilted at an awkward angle, one tire sunk deep into the mud. I pulled up behind it and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out into the freezing rain. The air was heavy, almost metallic, and the forest around me was eerily quiet, no rustling leaves, no animals, just the steady patter of rain. Sheriff's Department. I called out, shining my light on the car. Anyone inside? There was no response. I walked up to the driver's side window and peered inside. The car was empty, the keys still in the ignition, and the driver's seatbelt was unbuckled. I checked the back seat, empty. The floorboards were wet and muddy, like someone had gotten out in a hurry. I stepped back, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam caught a faint set of footprints leading away from the car and into the woods. They were small, probably a woman's, and they looked fresh. I radioed dispatch again, but all I got was static. Damn it, I muttered, pulling my jacket tighter against the rain. I had to make a decision. Protocol would have been to stay by the vehicle and wait for backup, but with no signal and no way of knowing how long she'd been out there, I couldn't just sit around. I followed the footprints, keeping my flashlight low and my hand on the grip of my sidearm. The tracks led deeper into the woods, zigzagging as though the person had been disoriented. The trees were thick, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, and the mud sucked at my boots with every step. I called out a few times, but my voice felt small and insignificant in the vast silence. After about 10 minutes, the footprints stopped. They didn't fade gradually, they just ended, like whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I shone my flashlight in every direction, trying to make sense of it. The ground was flat and muddy, there was no way she could have climbed a tree or doubled back without leaving more tracks. Ma'am. I called out, my voice echoing faintly. This is the Sheriff's Department. If you can hear me, please respond. Nothing. Just the rain. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, like a child laughing. It sent a chill down my spine, and I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The laugh came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't a child at all. It was too distorted, too wrong. Who's there? I demanded, drawing my weapon. No answer. The rain seemed to grow heavier, the sound of it roaring in my ears. I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of white against the darkness, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I started to back away, my instinct screaming at me to get out of there. As I turned to head back to the car, my flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled with it, smacking it against my palm until it came back to life. When the beam cut through the darkness again, I froze. A figure stood about 20 feet away, half hidden by the trees. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long and its posture unnatural, like a puppet hanging from invisible strings. Its face was pale and featureless, with dark hollows where the eyes and mouth should have been. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I aimed my weapon. "Stay where you are," I shouted. "Don't come any closer." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly, as though it were studying me. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the woods, moving with a jerky, inhuman gait. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran, my boots slipping in the mud as I made my way back to the road. When I reached the car, I jumped in and locked the doors, my chest heaving. The footprints were gone, erased by the rain, and the woods around me were as silent as ever. I radioed dispatch again, and this time, the signal came through. "I'm leaving Hollow Creek," I said, my voice shaking. "There's no one here." I didn't tell them about the figure. I didn't even mention the footprints. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the rain pounding against the windshield. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I never found out who made the call, and the coordinates dispatch received didn't lead to anything when we checked later. All I know is that something was out there, something that wasn't human. And whatever it was, it wanted me to follow. I've always hated foggy nights. Something about the way the mist wraps around everything, swallowing sound and sight alike, makes the world feel smaller and more claustrophobic. As a deputy sheriff in a remote area of the Pacific Northwest, fog was a frequent companion, especially in the rainy season. It made routine patrols feel like something out of a bad dream, where the roads seemed endless, and the trees loomed like shadowy giants. It was one of those nights, dense fog and a steady rain. My shift had been quiet so far, just a few calls about downed branches and minor flooding. I was cruising along an old stretch of highway that wound through the forest when dispatch came over the radio. "Unit 5, we've got a report of a stranded motorist near Hollow Point Bridge. Female caller said her car broke down, and she feels unsafe." I sighed, adjusting my grip on the wheel. Hollow Point Bridge was notorious for its isolation. It sat miles from anything resembling civilization, a rusted relic that spanned a narrow ravine. Locals avoided it, partly because of its state of disrepair and partly because of the stories, rumors about accidents and strange sightings. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but the idea of someone being stranded out there in this weather didn't sit right with me. "Copy that," I replied. "I'm on my way." The drive was slow, the fog thick enough to reflect my headlights back at me, and the rain hammering against the windshield in a relentless rhythm. The closer I got to the bridge, the worse the road became, potholes filled with water and loose gravel threatening to send the cruiser skidding. When I reached the bridge, I spotted the car immediately. It was an older sedan, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the fog. I pulled up behind it and stepped out, the rain soaking through my jacket almost instantly. The air was cold and heavy, the kind of chill that felt unnatural for early fall. "Sheriff's Department," I called out, approaching the driver's side of the car. The door was slightly open, and the interior light cast a faint glow on the wet pavement. I leaned in and saw that the car was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, and a purse sat on the passenger seat, its contents spilled out as if someone had left in a hurry. "Hello," I called again, scanning the area with my flashlight. The only response was the sound of rain hitting the metal bridge and the faint creak of the old structure shifting under its own weight. I moved around the car, shining the light into the woods on either side of the road. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the beam of the flashlight seemed to get swallowed up by the mist. I tried the radio, but the signal was patchy. "Dispatch, this is Unit 5. I'm at Hollow Point Bridge. The vehicle's here, but no sign of the driver. Over." Static crackled back at me, followed by a faint, garbled response that I couldn't make out. I shook my head and clipped the radio back onto my belt. I had two choices: wait by the car and hope the driver came back, or head into the woods to look for her. The second option wasn't appealing, but something about the abandoned car made me uneasy. The purse, the open door, it didn't feel right. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the road, my boots squelching in the muddy ground as I followed what looked like faint footprints leading into the trees. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife muted by the fog. The footprints were small, likely a woman's, and they meandered as though she'd been disoriented. I followed them deeper into the woods, the beam of my flashlight casting long shadows on the tree trunks. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice barely carrying in the heavy air. "This is the Sheriff's Department. If you can hear me, call out." No response. The footprints led me to a clearing where the ground sloped downward toward the ravine. The bridge loomed above, its rusted beams barely visible through the mist. I paused, shining the flashlight around the clearing. The rain had turned the ground into a muddy mess, and the footprints ended abruptly near the edge of the ravine. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the opposite side of the ravine, just at the edge of the fog. Her figure was barely visible, but the pale glow of her face stood out in the darkness. She was wearing a thin dress that clung to her body, soaked through by the rain, and her hair hung limply around her shoulders. "Ma'am," I shouted, relief flooding through me. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me, her face expressionless. Something about the way she held herself, completely still, like a statue, made my relief turn to unease. I looked for a way to cross the ravine. The bridge was too far back, and the slope was steep and slippery. I took a step closer to the edge, shining my flashlight on her. That's when I realized her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The woman tilted her head slightly, as though she were studying me, and then she smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too far across her face. "Stay back," I shouted, drawing my weapon. My voice echoed in the clearing, but the woman didn't react. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the ravine. I turned to look, my heart racing, and saw movement in the water below. Something pale and human-shaped was drifting along the surface, its limbs limp and its face hidden beneath the rushing current. I felt a wave of nausea as the figure disappeared into the fog, leaving only ripples behind. When I looked back, the woman was gone. I stumbled back toward the road, my mind racing. I had no idea what I'd just seen, but I knew I needed to leave. The forest felt darker, heavier, as though it were closing in around me. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the cruiser. I radioed dispatch, my voice barely steady. "This is Unit 5. No sign of the driver. I'm leaving the scene. Over." The drive back to town was a blur. The fog seemed thicker than ever, clinging to the road like a living thing. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was safely parked outside the station. I filed a brief report, omitting the details I couldn't explain, and went home, hoping to put the night behind me. But the woman's face haunts me. Every time it rains, I see her in my mind's eye, hovering at the edge of the fog, her too wide smile and unblinking stare. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for the next person to cross her path. Late shifts always brought a kind of quiet that wasn't entirely peaceful. In my rural Texas county, most nights were uneventful. A few routine calls about noise complaints, wandering cattle, or occasional bar fights. But the quiet wasn't always comforting, sometimes it felt like the silence itself was watching. It was one of those stormy nights where the rain never seemed to let up. Lightning illuminated the endless stretch of flatland, and thunder rolled across the fields like a distant drumbeat. I was parked near the old overpass on Route 14, catching up on some paperwork while the wipers struggled against the downpour. That's when the call came through. "Unit 4, we've got a report of someone walking near the drainage tunnels off Hollow Creek Road," the dispatcher said. I frowned, sitting up in my seat. Hollow Creek Road ran parallel to a set of old drainage tunnels built decades ago to prevent flooding. They were barely used anymore, except by kids looking to scare each other or spray paint the walls. "Did the caller give any details?" I asked. "Just said they saw a man standing near one of the entrances. Didn't seem to move, even when they drove past. Gave them the creeps." The dispatcher's tone was casual, but something about the description made my stomach tighten. People didn't wander around that area at night, especially not in weather like this. "I'm on it," I said, starting the cruiser and turning onto Hollow Creek Road. The drive was slow, the rain reducing visibility to just a few feet in front of the car. The road wound through a wooded area, the trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. The only sound was the rhythmic thump of the wipers and the occasional crack of thunder. When I reached the drainage tunnels, I parked on the shoulder and grabbed my flashlight. The headlights of the cruiser illuminated the entrance to the largest tunnel, a wide, gaping mouth of concrete that led into darkness. Rainwater gushed into it, creating a shallow stream that flowed out onto the road. "Sheriff's Department," I called out, stepping out into the rain. "Anyone here?" No response. I moved closer, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the heavy rain. The tunnel's entrance was graffitied with colorful tags and symbols, but the water running through it was murky and opaque. The air felt colder here, the kind of chill that didn't match the temperature of the rain. I swept the flashlight along the walls of the tunnel, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a shadow. A figure stood about 30 feet inside the tunnel, partially obscured by the darkness. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing away from me. His silhouette was tall and thin, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Sir," I called out, stepping closer. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch, as if he hadn't heard me at all. My boots splashed in the shallow water as I approached, my flashlight locked on the figure. The sound of the rain outside faded, replaced by the eerie echoes of my own footsteps. The deeper I went, the more the shadows seemed to close in around me. When I was about 10 feet away, I stopped. Something wasn't right. The man's posture was unnatural, his shoulders too rigid, his head tilted slightly to one side. The air inside the tunnel felt heavier, thick with a damp, metallic smell that made my stomach churn. "Sir," I said again, my voice steady but firm. "I need you to turn around slowly." He moved. But he didn't turn. Instead, his body shifted in a jerky, mechanical way, like a puppet on strings. He raised one arm, pointing deeper into the tunnel, and then froze again. My pulse quickened. I aimed my flashlight in the direction he was pointing, the beam slicing through the darkness. The light caught something glinting on the tunnel wall, wet streaks that looked like handprints, smeared and dripping. "Sir, I'm going to need you to." I stopped mid-sentence when I looked back at him. He was gone. The spot where he'd been standing was empty, the water rippling slightly as though something had just moved through it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the image of those handprints. Someone else could be in there, someone who needed help. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and pressed forward, the water sloshing around my boots. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of the rain outside fading into an eerie silence. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before stabilizing. The metallic smell grew stronger, and my breathing echoed loudly in the confined space. Then I saw it. A figure lay in the water, face down and motionless. It was a man, his clothes torn and muddy, his arms stretched out as though he'd been crawling. My heart raced as I knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. His skin was ice cold, and his chest wasn't moving. I radioed for backup, but all I got was static. The signal must have been blocked by the tunnel. I reached for my phone, but there was no service. As I leaned closer, trying to get a better look at his face, I felt it, a faint breath against my cheek. My head snapped up, and I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the tunnel. The man who'd been standing earlier was there again, closer this time, his face partially illuminated by the light. His features were wrong, distorted, as though his skin had been stretched too tightly over his bones. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and his eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull the light in and swallow it whole. He stepped forward, his movements unnatural, his limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly as I tried to keep it steady. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the confined space. He didn't stop. The sound of splashing water filled the tunnel as he advanced, his grin widening impossibly. The man on the ground let out a low, guttural groan, his body twitching as though trying to rise. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, my boots slipping on the wet concrete as I ran toward the entrance. The sound of footsteps followed me, heavy and deliberate, echoing in time with my own. When I finally burst out into the rain, I didn't stop running until I reached the cruiser. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. My flashlight lay on the passenger seat, its beam flickering faintly. The tunnel loomed in the distance, dark and silent. There was no sign of the figures, no movement, no sound, nothing but the relentless rain. I didn't file a report about what I'd seen that night. Officially, the call was logged as a false alarm, and I left it at that. But I haven't gone back to Hollow Creek Road since. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I think about that man in the tunnel and the way his grin seemed to stretch beyond the limits of his face. And I wonder if he's still down there, waiting for someone else to follow him into the darkness. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.